Welcome, everyone. I have 12 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. I hope that everyone is staying warm. I would like to welcome you to our fourth Libraries Lunch and Learn event of the year. I am Amy Petz, the Executive Secretary of the Friends of the Alexander M. Bracken Library. And this year, our Lunch and Learn series is designed to highlight the transformative scholarship of Ball State University's faculty, showcasing research that drives innovation and fosters collaborations across disciplines. Libraries have long served as dynamic hubs for interdisciplinary dialogue, providing the collections, resources, and support that empower groundbreaking research and inspire new connections across fields. I am delighted to share in today's conversation and explore the exciting ideas that emerge when disciplines intersect. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to Nick Havranek, who will introduce our distinguished faculty presenter.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, as she said, I am Nick Havranek, and I am the assistant to the executive secretary of the Friends of Bracken Library, as well as being the engagement strategies coordinator for university libraries. And really quick, before I get into our special guest today, you should have been notified, but this meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Ball State University Library's YouTube channel on a playlist where we have all of the past virtual lunch and learn events. Um, so yeah, our special guest speaker today is Dr. Richard Petz, Associate Dean of the College of Sciences and Humanities and Professor of Sociology here at Ball State University, and he will discuss his recent book titled Father Involvement and Gender Equality in the United States, Contemporary Norms and Barriers. The book provides an overview of fatherhood in the United States today to explore why fathers continue to be less involved in childcare than mothers, and to strategize about how we can work toward encouraging and promoting greater father involvement. In doing so, this book provides a unique and important contribution to our understanding of the culture of fatherhood in the US and the implications of father involvement for gender equality through the use of quantitative data and interviews with fathers. Um, Richard joined the sociology department here at Ball State in 2008. He received his BA from Michigan State University and earned his MA and PhD from Ohio State University. His research focuses on family inequalities with a specific emphasis on parental leave, father involvement, and workplace flexibility as policies and practices that can reduce gender inequality, promote greater work-family balance, and provide family well-being. His current projects focus on understanding how the pandemic has affected mothers and fathers, the role of fathers in promoting gender equality, and how parental leave policy design affects perceptions of leave taking. He has published extensively in academic outlets, and his work has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and Bloomberg. In addition to research, he currently teaches courses in sociology, um, population dynamics, family sociology, social problems, and the intro to Soc. Um, and without further ado, I will hand things over to him.
Thanks, Nick. And I want to thank Nick and University Libraries for inviting me to present as part of the virtual Lunch and Learn series. And I appreciate all of those who are in attendance today. As Nick mentioned, I'll be talking about my recent book, which is titled Father Involvement and Gender Equality in the United States, Contemporary Norms and Barriers. But before I get into the book, I first want to thank the libraries for their support in writing this book. At one point, I had a stack of books sitting on my desk that I referenced regularly. And even more importantly than the books that I had from the library, I frequently use LibKey and interlibrary loan, and I am frequently impressed by how quickly that office, that department, provides articles. There was a request I had earlier this year where I got it within minutes. And like I didn't even have time to do anything else. And I already had the article on my desk. So that kind of excellent work really helps to facilitate the research that I do. And so I want to just publicly thank the libraries because the book would not have been possible without their support. So for some background, there's a fairly sizable literature that clearly illustrates the positive consequences associated with greater father involvement. For example, children benefit when they have an involved father through things like greater cognitive development, fewer behavior problems, and doing better in school. Mothers experience less stress and greater well-being when fathers are more involved at home, and couples experience more satisfying, stable relationships when fathers are more involved at home. Fathers themselves also benefit from being involved in their children's lives in numerous ways. So many people, myself included, promote these benefits to encourage fathers to be more involved at home. And as we as a society become more aware of the benefits of father involvement, fathers increasingly say that they want to be more engaged parents. But despite the benefits of father involvement and fathers' desires to be more engaged parents, levels of father involvement are generally quite low. When it comes to domestic labor, mothers continue to shoulder the burden. Specifically, mothers spend about 50% more time on childcare and about 75% more time on housework than fathers on average. Expectations for father involvement are actually so low that fathers are often praised simply for helping out at home, whereas mothers are judged if they do not excel in their expected roles of caregiver and homemaker. And anecdotally, I've seen this play out numerous times in my own life. I remember one example many years ago, and my kids were quite young, that I took the kids to the grocery store to get them out of the house and to give my wife some relief from parenting. While we were there, we were done shopping, we went to check out, and lines were quite long. And as you can imagine, after being in a store for a while, the kids got, a little bit rowdy. The person in front of me pitied me, smiled, and let me skip the line in front of them. And the cashier was actually quite friendly. She smiled at me and she said, my kids were actually quite well behaved and much better behaved than a lot of the kids that she saw in the store. So here I was sort of unable to sort of really reel my kids in and calm them down. I was doing a mediocre job of parenting at best, and I was being praised for it. I was being accommodated. People were being friendly towards me. Whereas in similar situations, my wife has been glared at numerous times. So why does this parenting double standard exist? And why is there this disparity between fathers knowing the benefits of father involvement and wanting to be involved, yet not actually spending much time in these tasks relative to mothers? And what can we do to reduce this disparity and work toward greater gender equality? These are really the key questions I seek to answer in this book. What we know is that to achieve greater gender equality, two things need to happen. First, women need to have greater opportunities in the paid labor market. And second, men need to be more involved in domestic labor. Now, as a society, we've made far more progress in the public sphere than in the private sphere. Prevailing gendered expectations that women should be devoted to family and men should be devoted to work result in the family being a key institution in which gender inequality is reproduced and perpetuated. If men were equally engaged in childcare and housework as women, the burden of this work on women would be reduced, society would come to better appreciate the importance of domestic labor, and there would be a more equal playing field in the paid labor market. So to assess disparities between fathers' attitudes and their behaviors and the implications of these gaps for gender equality, I address the following aims in this book. First, I examine attitudes toward fatherhood and whether these attitudes match fathers' behaviors. Second, I consider barriers that prevent fathers from being more involved at home. And finally, I offer some suggestions on how we might overcome these barriers and enable more fathers to be equally engaged in childcare and housework and ultimately work toward greater gender equality. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on these first two aims, but I'll touch briefly, very briefly, on the third aim at the end. But of course, I'm happy to elaborate and answer any questions if folks have some. Data, I'm not going to get too much into this, but just to let you know, I use a variety of data sources. I have quantitative data from 5 national surveys. You're going to see data from the first 3 surveys here in this presentation. I'm happy to geek out on data and quantitative stuff with you later if you have questions or want more information. I also conducted interviews with 13 fathers. These were married fathers who resided in the US who had at least one child under the age of 10. This is by no means a representative sample, although there was some diversity in regard to education and social class. These fathers' stories are really used to give a face or a story to the patterns observed in the national survey data. I do also want to note that this book primarily focuses on different gender couple families due primarily to data restrictions and the fact that this is still the most common 2-parent family structure in the US. So while my data does not necessarily directly address more diverse family forms, I argue that all families benefit if we change our expectations of fatherhood, and this will ultimately help to change gendered parenting norms. So first goal of the study, what do people think about fatherhood? What are the contemporary attitudes about fatherhood today? But to understand this, we first need to think about the traditional concept of fatherhood. So the traditional concept of fatherhood reflects the stereotypical 1950s separate spheres model where fathers were primary breadwinners and mothers stayed home to care for the kids and look after the house. These fathers were not expected to be involved parents. They engaged in traditional masculine tasks like disciplining children and playing with them, but overall involvement was low. Fathers in the 1950s spent less than 3 hours a week in childcare activities. Now, while the image of the traditional father persists and fathers today are still expected to be economic providers, times have changed. In contrast to the 1950s, most families are dual earner families where both parents work in paid employment. There's also been a shift in the culture of fatherhood, where fathers are now expected to be actively engaged in domestic tasks and act nurturing toward children. Fathers today spend over twice the amount of time in childcare compared to fathers in the 1950s, although they still do far less than mothers. This concept of fatherhood in the literature is often referred to as new fatherhood to signify a shift away from the traditional fatherhood concept. But scholars have coined numerous other terms to describe this culture, such as caring or nurturing fatherhood. And so when I look at the data that I analyzed for this book, we see that fathers today largely embrace the idea that fathers should be engaged, nurturing parents. Descriptive data from the Survey of Contemporary Fatherhood shows that over 90% of fathers believe that fathers should play an active role in their children's lives, that father involvement is essential for children's well-being, and that fathers should be as heavily involved as mothers. The vast majority of fathers also believe that fathers are equally as good at meeting children's needs as mothers. And the endorsement of the new fatherhood concept is not just restricted to fathers. So using data from a different survey that included both men and women respondents, I find that results are largely similar across all US adults, both men and women, parents and non-parents. There's widespread belief among American adults that fathers should be highly engaged in children's lives. And although this item is not shown in this slide, there's also widespread agreement that fathers should share housework equally with mothers as well. So there's clear evidence that more is expected of fathers today than in the past. And what I think is particularly important from these survey results is not just that fathers should be highly involved, but that they should be as equally involved as mothers. Now, there's a big difference between involvement and equal involvement, but the theme of equal involvement was commonly discussed by the fathers I interviewed. For example, John told me that part of what makes a good father is just contributing an equal share in keeping the house afloat. Adam also discussed having to share responsibility for tasks, stating, I think the responsibilities of a home are both sides. So being a man, you're still going to have to wash dishes. You're still going to have to sweep the floor. Similarly, Michael said, my goal personally is never to have my partner feel like she's shouldering more of the burden of parenting than me. And finally, Jason's discussion of fatherhood was really interesting because he made a direct comparison between traditional fathers and contemporary fathers and how this expectation has shifted over time. And after describing the shift, he said it's not that she does that thing or he does that type of thing. I mean, certainly there's certain activities that I prefer to do that my wife doesn't like to do, and it's the other way around as well. But for the most part, it's understanding that we're both equal and both contribute the same amount to their development and growth. So given these attitudes in support of fathers being equally involved as mothers, I argue that previous labels to describe the current concept of fatherhood are inadequate. The current discourse, which includes labels such as involved fatherhood and nurturing fatherhood, largely suggests that fathers should simply be more involved than in the past, which actually sets a pretty low bar when we look at how unengaged fathers were in previous generations. Moreover, vague conceptualizations of involved fatherhood help to perpetuate gender inequalities in domestic labor, as they enable fathers to be able to strongly endorse the importance of being an engaged father and doing more, while still doing far less than mothers. And perhaps not surprisingly, I find evidence of exactly this. To assess the relationship between fathers' attitudes and their behaviors, I predict the probability that fathers are highly engaged in various activities based on their attitudes toward fatherhood. So if you look particularly at this bottom row here, fathers who are classified as having high engaged dad attitudes are those that strongly agreed with all of those items, all of those survey items I previously showed. And as we can see, fathers who more strongly endorse attitudes about engaged fatherhood are more involved than fathers who do not endorse this concept. So what that means is that fathers are more likely to engage in active parenting behaviors, such as reading to children and putting children to bed frequently, and are more likely to always act warm and affectionate toward children when they embrace attitudes toward engaged fatherhood. So encouraging more fathers to embrace this concept of fatherhood is important for getting fathers more involved. But there's still a gap between attitudes and behaviors. Even among fathers who fully endorse the idea that fathers should be highly engaged, less than half are actually frequently engaged in active parenting behaviors. Similarly, there's a fair probability that fathers who support engaged fatherhood attitudes do not frequently act warm toward their children. So this disparity between attitudes and behaviors helps us to understand why gender inequality in domestic labor continues to persist. There's widespread belief that father involvement is important and that fathers should be as equally involved as mothers. But although fathers are more involved than in the past, most fathers are not equally engaged. So to more adequately capture the belief that fathers should be as equally involved as mothers, I label the current concept of fatherhood the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood. This concept suggests that fathers should be highly engaged in all aspects of domestic life, including childcare, housework, and cognitive labor. This concept goes beyond other labels to better specify how involved fathers should actually be. As such, the fully engaged dad concept has important implications for gender equality. For substantive change to occur, simply being more involved is not enough. Instead, fathers need to be fully engaged in all aspects of domestic life. Although I believe this concept adequately describes the culture of fatherhood, given the survey data, it's not yet the norm for fatherhood. And this distinction is important. Once concepts are established as social norms, there are pressures to adhere to these expectations. So changing the gender nature of domestic work is only really possible if the fully engaged dad concept becomes embedded as a cultural norm. Unfortunately, there are other cultural norms and structural barriers that prevent this from happening. And I focus on two of these to better understand why the disparity between attitudes and behaviors persist. First, I'll look at the persistence of traditional gender norms and ideal worker norms that are reinforced through structural workplace barriers. So, as I noted, culture of fatherhood has changed. Aspects of traditional fatherhood continue to persist. And notably, as part of that, fathers are still expected to be family breadwinners. We also need to consider the extent to which gender norms of masculinity, as well as traditional motherhood norms, contribute to the gender division of labor. So hegemonic masculine norms, such as being independent, non-emotional, and tough, align more closely with the traditional concept of fatherhood than the fully engaged dad concept. Furthermore, hegemonic ideas of femininity, such as being nice, domestic, and caring for others, help to shape perceptions that women are innately more nurturing than men. Mothers are also expected to be intensive mothers. That is because mothers are believed to be innately better parents than fathers. The expectation is that they should live child-centered lives and should want to be intensively involved parents. Now, these norms align closely with separate spheres ideology, which suggests that mothers are innately better qualified to perform domestic tasks, whereas fathers are innately better qualified to perform paid work. Now, although this traditional family model no longer matches reality for most families, its cultural relevance continues to persist. Despite more favorable attitudes toward egalitarianism over time, Americans are more supportive of gender equality in paid work than gender equality in domestic labor. And the traditional family arrangement is still the most desired family model among contemporary young adults. Now, these beliefs directly contradict the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood, suggesting that fathers are indeed lesser parents and that mothers thus should take on the primary roles within the domestic sphere. As such, these attitudes contribute to broader patterns of gender inequality. So, looking at the extent to which some of these ideas and support for traditional parenthood roles persist, I find some interesting results. So, consistent with the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood, over 2/3 of adults believe that fathers should be at least partly responsible for cognitive labor within families. And the majority of adults disagree that women are happier if they stay home to take care of children. But men are significantly more likely to agree with traditional norms of motherhood than women are. You can see that the gray lines are longer than the greenish lines. And the majority of men believe that a mother's primary role is to take care of home and family, that bottom survey item there. Now, remember back to the earlier slides I showed where the vast majority of men believe that fathers should be equally involved as mothers. Now, this seems directly contradictory to me. How can men reconcile the idea that fathers and mothers should equally share in housework and childcare, yet this should also be mother's primary role? My interviews with fathers helped to shed light on this contradiction. All of the fathers I interviewed talked about being an actively engaged parent. And for the most part, these fathers all embraced the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood and talked about how roles should be equally shared between both parents. Yet, in talking about how things were divided in their families, fathers often talked about how mothers were more responsible for all of the cognitive labor. One topic that came up a lot was kids' clothing. Many of the dads I spoke to were clueless about their child's clothing and clearly were not fully engaged in this time-consuming task. For example, John told me that all household duties were equally divided in the family. He even gave me a detailed list of all of the tasks that he performs. But when it comes to kids' clothes, he was clueless. He said, in terms of my kids' stuff, my wife tends to take the lead on most child-related things. I definitely say the clothing and the homework. She totally thinks about and organizes kids' clothes way more than I do. I'm sort of the clueless dad in the world of kids' clothes. I sort of know what sizes they are, but my wife does all the shopping. Other fathers expressed a similar level of cluelessness, stating that they were willing to run to the store to pick things up, but needed mothers to tell them what items and in what sizes to get. Now, admittedly, I am in the same boat as these fathers. My wife is always the one to check our kids' wardrobe well in advance to make sure they have things that fit for the upcoming season. This issue of kids' clothing, I think, is a great illustration of how fathers can believe they are equally engaged, yet mothers still bear primary responsibility. John, by all accounts, is an involved father. Yet he says his wife takes the lead on most child-related things. Later in our interview, John told me, quote, I get that the wife has to do that sort of management aspect of things that's more work in itself and it takes a toll. Mothers are often solely responsible for all of the family planning and management, yet this is often thought of as separate from childcare and housework. So fathers get to ignore this time-consuming aspect of domestic labor and perceive themselves to be fully engaged when in fact they are not. The inability to see this disparity, or in John's case, recognizing the disparity but not considering cognitive labor to be something he should be responsible for, is a reflection of larger patterns of gender inequality. Now, while many fathers I interviewed claimed that domestic labor was divided equally, other fathers acknowledged gender disparities. Yet, some fathers said these disparities were due to mothers' choices. This emerged as a second way in which traditional gender norms enabled fathers to believe strongly in the fully engaged dad concept, yet still do far less domestic labor than mothers. For example, Jeremy and his partner both worked until they had a child. He told me that they prioritized his job and his wife stayed at home by choice. In talking about fairness in the division of labor, he said, I don't think it's fair, but I also don't think that fairness is really possible in this situation. Because if I'm working and she's staying at home, I mean, she enjoys staying home with him. It was her choice. It was something she wanted because there was an opportunity to have him in daycare just a little bit. What is perceived by Jeremy to be a personal choice is actually the effects of broader gender structures, which constrain women's ability to freely choose in these situations and pressure women to prioritize intensive parenting above all else. Other fathers I interviewed talked about how mothers were either better at certain tasks, that fathers themselves were worse at certain tasks, or both. For example, Brian said, I would probably say she does more of the household tasks per se, like laundry and stuff. But that was a choice thing. She doesn't like everything in the dryer, everything in the wash. She had a very specific way of doing things. So it became, I would have done it wrong. Similarly, Erin said, I think watching her family and her parents, she had an innate sense of like, this is how things work. So I don't want to say we kind of fell into it, but we kind of know like, I'm not going to dust. I just don't care enough to dust. I don't care enough to clean. Some people are not affected by their environment and the disarray, where my wife is emotionally affected by her environment. Things are messy, if things are out of place, it affects her disposition. So she needs to clean. And she cleans better than I do. Whether I choose not to clean just so she does it, who knows? Overall, it was apparent from my interviews that gender norms of parenting play a key role in explaining the gap between fathers' attitudes and their behaviors. Mother's primary responsibility for domestic tasks seems largely assumed, whereas fathers can pick and choose the tasks they enjoy or the tasks they feel they are good at. The result is that fathers can perceive themselves to be fully engaged dads because they are doing more, while still avoiding much of the domestic responsibility. Consequently, gender inequality in these tasks persist. Now, in addition to intensive motherhood norms, gender norms about masculinity likely also contribute to the gap between fathers' attitudes and behaviors. As noted previously, traditional norms of masculinity often directly contrast with contemporary fatherhood attitudes, as fathers may express a desire to be a fully engaged dad, yet also show that they are independent, aggressive, and lack emotion. Interestingly, in the survey data, there does not appear to be widespread endorsement of all aspects of traditional masculinity, but some attitudes continue to persist. For example, the majority of fathers believe it is important for others to know they are not gay, and slightly less than the majority stress the importance of independence and are restrictive with their emotions. However, far fewer fathers believe that it is hard to express affection toward children. Thus, fathers may try to adhere to masculine norms in public while also maintain efforts to be a fully engaged dad at home. And consistent with the survey data, masculinity was not a major theme in my interviews with fathers. In fact, when I asked fathers about masculinity, most of them struggled to answer and said that it wasn't really something that they ever really thought about. Yet, even though this was not something that they were consciously thinking about, we know that the broader gender structure influences behaviors, even if it does so in hidden ways. Research suggests that fathers who embrace caring masculinity actually focus on selective, more masculine parenting tasks and avoid more traditional feminine tasks. And there was clear evidence of this in my interviews with fathers. For example, Matthew said, And then the nurturing side comes more from my wife, obviously, than it does for me. I'm more of the letting him fall down and, okay, now you gotta, you can fall and skin your knee and you're gonna survive type thing. Additionally, Brandon stressed the importance of teaching his daughters independence, focusing on traditionally masculine tasks. He said, I have two girls. I want to be the dad that teaches my kids that they're not going to grow up to be the girls that don't know how to do anything. I want them to know how to change a tire. I want them to know how to do general maintenance on a car. I want them to be able to take care of themselves and just show them all the stuff I feel like you're supposed to know. Despite stressing the importance of being equally engaged in all aspects of children's lives, many fathers acknowledge that mothers are more nurturing than they are. This leads fathers to focus more on traditional masculine forms of involvement. This enables fathers to believe that they are equally engaged parents and contributing in important ways, while also avoiding many time-intensive, emotionally draining domestic tasks. The end result is that fathers appear to be meeting cultural expectations of being more involved, while simultaneously putting pressure on mothers to be the primary caregiver and homemaker. For this to change, I argue that we need to move beyond current conceptualizations of fatherhood and masculinity to embrace the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood. By viewing fathers as equally capable as mothers and holding fathers accountable to these expectations, we can work to dismantle the traditional perceptions we have of mothers and fathers as innately different. Of course, this is no easy task for many reasons, one of which I address next. So part of the reason why gender norms are so hard to change is that these norms are firmly embedded in our social structure and reinforced by the culture and organization of paid work. The value of hard work is strongly ingrained into American culture, and devoting oneself to work above all else is seen as a badge of honor and mark of success. So individuals who adhere to this work-first culture are seen as ideal workers. Ideal workers are those who prioritize work above all else, demonstrate commitment to their employer, are always available to work and willing to work long hours, and who are assumed to not have family obligations that might prevent them from placing work first. These norms have become the standard by which employees are judged, and individuals often derive their own sense of self-worth based on adherence to these norms. But ideal worker norms pose a problem for parenting and gender equality. One cannot be both an intensive parent that is devoted to family and an ideal worker that is devoted to work. And these ideal worker norms intersect with gender norms. So women are assumed to be devoted to family and thus have to work even harder to demonstrate adherence to ideal worker norms. In contrast, men are assumed to prioritize breadwinning and thus only face high pressures to be an ideal worker. I think about this as a scale. For mothers, intensive motherhood and ideal worker norms are equally strong, given that most mothers work. So mothers have to constantly try to manage these competing demands. In contrast, the scale is heavily tipped toward ideal worker norms for fathers. Being a fully engaged dad is desired and encouraged, but not expected, whereas adhering to ideal worker norms is seen as obligatory for men. This imbalance means that the pressure to be an ideal worker and the lack of pressure to be a fully engaged dad leads workplaces to pose particular challenges for father involvement. I focus on three ways in which this occurs. First, I'll talk about general pressures for fathers to demonstrate devotion to work. Second, I'll talk about fathers' lack of access to family supportive workplace policies that may help fathers to be more involved at home. And third, I'll talk about penalties that fathers experience when they use these policies. So first, the fathers I spoke with all discussed ways in which work prevented them from being as engaged of a father as they wanted to be. Many fathers talked about time at work detracting from time at home. For example, Brandon worked the most hours of any of the fathers I interviewed far and away. And he spoke about how this limited his ability to be a fully engaged dad. He said, my day typically starts at 3:45 in the morning and I get home at 6:30 at night. I get home and it's like a couple hours before the kids are in bed. So I come home and I try to play with them as hard as I can and do whatever. Try to eat and do bedtime and all that, but I'm afraid I won't be there when they get older and do sports and stuff. I work weekends, I work nights, I work odd hours. Unless something changes, I don't think I'll ever be there like I want to be. but I do the best I can. Other fathers told me about pressures they faced to demonstrate devotion to work, even though they prioritized being a fully engaged dad above all else. Michael was an interesting case here. So Michael started his career as an architect, which required very long hours. He left his job before having kids for a career in academia to set himself up for better work-life balance. He became a parent while in graduate school and talked about the pressures he faced in regard to ideal worker norms. He said, because most of the grad students were younger, were not married, didn't have families, didn't have family obligations, my thought was everybody knows I'm married and I have kids. But I don't ever want the kids to become an excuse for why people think I'm not working as hard as them, or I'm not doing what I should be doing. I never wanted the kids to be a reason why people were going to say, oh yeah, the reason Michael's not working up to snuff is because he's got those kids at home. I never wanted that to happen. So my attitude in grad school was everybody knows I have kids, but I'm not going to make the kids a problem. Michael's case sounds similar to what you often hear from mothers, that they have to work harder to show that kids are not going to stop them from being an ideal worker. But without the cultural pressures to be fully engaged dads, fathers often feel more obligated to conform to workplace expectations. And this may lead fathers to feel guilty if they're not working enough or are seen to be prioritizing family over work. For example, Jeremy told me this story. My friend messaged me the other day and he was like, do you ever work? Because it seems like you're always posting pictures of all the things you're doing with your kids. And that made me feel weird because I'm like, oh my God, am I not working enough? We see that the importance of ideal worker norms for fathers uniquely pressured fathers to adhere to these norms and even feel guilty if they're not placing work first. Now, one thing that may enable parents to better balance work and family obligations and desires is access to family-friendly workplace policies, such as workplace flexibility and parental leave. Evidence suggests that these policies can help fathers to be more engaged at home. Fathers who work from home at least sometimes spend more time on housework and childcare, and paternity leave is positively associated with father engagement and co-parenting over the long term. Unfortunately, most fathers lack access to these policies. Now, this is nationally representative data taken from the American Time Use Survey prior to the pandemic. Respondents were asked whether they can take paid leave from their job for various reasons, and we can see that just over half of fathers can take paid leave for the birth of a child or to care for a sick family member. But less than half of fathers can take paid leave for childcare reasons that are unrelated to sickness. In addition, less than 1/3 of fathers report ever being able to work from home, and most fathers do not have occasional or frequent flexibility in their work hours. Now, these are pre-pandemic data, so you might be asking, oh, that's all changed, right? In a recent survey I conducted in 2024, I just looked at these numbers last week for this presentation, 55% of fathers in a national survey report not being able to work remotely. So this lack of access to flexible work continues to persist. So I discussed these policies with the fathers I interviewed, and fathers either expressed frustration with the lack of workplace flexibility or stressed that workplace flexibility was a key reason why they could be an involved father. For example, almost all of the fathers I interviewed took only 1 week off work when their first child was born, and most had to use either vacation days or an informal arrangement to even take that short period of time off. Aaron was the exception. He was entitled to 3 weeks of paternity leave, and so he took the longest leave among any father I interviewed, which is not long in the grand scheme of things. But his first son was born premature and spent a month in the NICU. So he had to return to work even before his son was home from the hospital. He said, I felt I needed to be at home helping my wife. Obviously, she went through a decent spell of depression post-birth when he came home. So my wife is left to ponder over all this and I have to go to work. I also couldn't spend as much time with him. I would have liked to have been more involved post-birth for an extended period of time, for a longer period of time than what I was given. So even when fathers have access to policies that seem generous by US standards, they're often not sufficient in enabling fathers to be fully engaged dads. John also spoke to me about frustrations he had with lack of flexibility at work. He recounted one story about trying to integrate flexibility, saying, I figured out that some people were taking their lunch break late in the afternoon to pick their kids up from school, like a couple of women in my workplace. And I started doing the same thing, and it was very helpful for my family. My wife didn't have to pick the kids up from school and could spend more time in the office. The director of my work told me I couldn't do that because I need to be there during the afternoon in case I was needed. John's story really illustrates the power of ideal worker norms for men. It was more acceptable in John's workplace for women workers to use flexibility because they were expected to also have parenting obligations. Now, while this likely disadvantaged them within the workplace environment, the same opportunities were not extended to John. Consequently, John's wife had to bear more of the parenting responsibilities, enabling gender inequality within his family to persist. In addition to lack of access to family supportive policies, fathers also discussed penalties they faced when prioritizing family over work. Workers often face a flexibility stigma when they are perceived to be prioritizing family over work and violating ideal worker norms. Indeed, one recent survey showed that 74% of fathers are fearful of taking parental leave because they believe they will be penalized for doing so. This was exactly the situation for one of the fathers I interviewed. Jeremy recounted how he was fired for requesting the parental leave to which he was entitled, saying, I told my supervisor that my wife is pregnant and I looked up parental leave and need to start taking it April 1st. She basically responded with, oh, that's bad timing. Why did she get pregnant? And that was very upsetting to me because this was a planned pregnancy and we were very, very excited. And then she emails me later saying, we need to talk about the parental leave. She said, this is the type of job where you can't take leave, and so you're going to need to find another job. Now, we find clear evidence of flexibility stigma in survey experiments where participants evaluate a worker who has taken paid parental leave. We find that fathers who take longer leaves are perceived to be less committed to their job, less likely to be promoted or given a raise at work, more likely to have their work responsibilities reduced, and more likely to be fired compared to workers who take shorter leave or no leave at all. Overall, the intersection of ideal worker and gender norms pose a unique barrier for fathers to be fully engaged dads. The lack of clear societal expectations for fathers to be highly engaged at home leads fathers to be more strongly pulled to adhere to ideal worker norms. And most fathers lack access to policies that may enable them to be more involved at home and are discouraged or penalized for using these policies even when they are available. So as illustrated throughout this presentation, the culture of fatherhood has changed such that US adults believe that fathers should be highly engaged, nurturing parents, and they should be as equally involved as mothers. Yet, although fathers are more involved today than in the past, there's still a notable gap between fathers' attitudes and their actions. And this gap is a major contributor to gender inequality, as mothers remain primarily responsible for childcare, housework, and especially cognitive and emotional labor. The core argument I make in this book is that to achieve greater gender equality, we need to embrace a concept of fatherhood within the United States that establishes the expectation that fathers should share equally in all of the household and parenting tasks. I call this the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood, and argue that setting clear expectations that fathers should be equally involved and held responsible for performing their share of all household and parenting duties is essential for eliminating parenting double standards and working toward gender equality. By establishing the fully engaged dad concept as a cultural norm, domestic tasks would no longer be optional for fathers, gendered assumptions made by workplaces would have to change, and motherhood norms would have to adapt away from essentialist views toward a more egalitarian model. Obviously, changing social norms is not easy, but I believe that doing so is vital if we hope to work toward greater gender equality. Now, there are numerous steps we can take to encourage and institutionalize the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things briefly. At the societal level, implementing a national paid leave policy would enable fathers to learn how to be an engaged parent right from the start. National policy would also help to normalize leave taking, which may help to reduce the current stigmas that exist. Workplaces also need to become more accepting and encouraging of workers who take leave. Additionally, expanding access to flexible workplace policies would help fathers to be more engaged at home. We made some progress with this during COVID, but we still see evidence of workplaces demanding sort of in-person work. I saw that the new governor just announced that all state workers will be returning to in-person work this summer. At the family and individual level, we can all try to work toward greater equality in our everyday lives. Fathers can take primary responsibility for individual tasks to take some of the burden off mothers. Parents can communicate about their domestic responsibilities to increase transparency, particularly about cognitive labor that's often hidden. And fathers can be more vocal and bold about their desires to be fully engaged dads. Ultimately, by establishing the fully engaged dad concept of fatherhood as a cultural norm and providing structural opportunities for fathers to meet this cultural standard, I believe that we can achieve greater gender equality within the United States. If you're interested in learning more, interested in reading the book, it is available at Bracken Libraries. So I encourage you to utilize university libraries for access to this resource. And I just want to thank you all for listening.
Great, thank you so much. If there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat. Um,
I do have a question for Richard, if that's okay. Richard, thank you so much for describing your research. That was super interesting. One thing I was thinking about throughout your talk was how the increasing diversification of family structures fits into some of these patterns and some of your key findings. I was particularly wrestling with like whether the rates of divorce and single parent homes that we see today, if that reifies some of these patterns or if it disrupts some of these conventional assumptions around fatherhood or approaches to fatherhood. And I was especially thinking about in my family sociology class this past semester, my students were introduced me to like a TikTok trend where people show the differences between like their room and their like set up at like their father's house versus their mother's house. So it's like, the shampoo and conditioner from the dollar store at their father's house versus like really fancy shampoo and conditioner at their mother's house. So kind of going back to my question, like I'm curious if you looked at some of these depictions within single parent households or shared custody households and whether, you think that these trends are disrupting or reifying some of the patterns that you discussed.
A great question. I don't have these data. From what I know from the literature, it's sort of a mixed bag. That oftentimes mothers still sort of take on primary responsibility. So even if there's shared custody, it's often not equally shared. Mothers still often have children more than fathers do. And mothers still bear most of the responsibility for all of the organizing, all of the cognitive labor, right? So even if fathers have the children for half the time, it's more common for mothers to do all of the scheduling, right? So it's like, oh, you have the kids for the next three days. They have this, this, and this on these days. So mothers are still sort of bearing a lot of that burden. Now, the increasing diversification of family has a lot of potential to sort of make progress in these arenas, right? Part of what I argue in this book and elsewhere is that, if you give fathers time to be more engaged, they become more confident and comfortable doing some of these tasks. So, even just sort of having that sole responsibility for parenting for a few days, fathers are going to be more comfortable and confident in their ability to be a parent in that regard. So I do think it has potential. I don't think we've necessarily seen it yet in the data I'm aware of, but I do think it's one thing that can contribute to greater father involvement over time. I think another sort of challenge that helps in both positive and negative ways is the perceptions we have as a society of these diverse family forms. We're doing some research now in regard to perceptions of parental leave and how these vary by diverse family forms. So are people viewing a married mother taking parental leave differently than they're viewing a married lesbian mother or a single mother or a single father? And what we find is that single fathers are actually viewed quite favorably among fathers, and so there's this expectation if you're a single father, you probably have to do some of the childcare, and so yeah, you probably need leave for that purpose. Whereas if you're married to a man or a woman as a man, that's less important for you because you have someone else at home, a feminine typed person at home who can take care of some of that. So I think increasing family diversity is complicating the story. I think there's potential for greater progress, but it's also presenting additional challenges. So sort of a mixed bag.
Any other questions? Don't see any in the chat. Well, if there are no other questions, I will go ahead and start wrapping up then. Thank you so much, Richard. That was all very interesting. I love looking at like the society and masculinity complexes and all that stuff. And it was interesting seeing a lot of that come through in the quotes you presented. So even if they weren't aware of what they were saying, it was interesting. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming. And again, this recording will be uploaded to the University Library's YouTube channel. And the next Lunch and Learn will be on February 20th, featuring Dr. Todd Trapp, Professor of Exercise Science in the School of Kinesiology. So yes, have a great rest of your day, and thank you again, Richard.
Thanks, Nick.